Okay, another edition of Jesus Returns. This is another edition of the Jesus Tales series. This particular edition is Jesus Returns, setting the stage. And there's going to be a few in this series of, in particular, Jesus returning, specifically from the exile in Babylon. But before we get to the second coming of Jesus, mostly celebrated by the author of Zechariah 1 through 6, we're going to talk about the prophecies concerning him. Zechariah seems to be written with the idea of answering certain prophecies of Jeremiah. I'll try to keep this conversation simply about the literature. Whether prophecy is real or not, it is real in the context of these literary creations, just as Harry Potter riding a broomstick is real in the books and movies he is a part of. If this is simply literature, then the author of Jeremiah wants you to think he is writing in the last days of Jerusalem, and it is enjoyable to simply let the stories lead the reader through the various prophecies by one author in Jeremiah and the various responses by other authors of Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemiah, and even found in Daniel chapter 9. The only reality needed is that these stories exist, and a character named Jesus, son of Jehozadak, was prophesied about, fulfilled that prophecy in at least one responding text, and is very important in at least two other texts in their final form. I will eventually posit that Ezra and Nehemiah contain evidence of having been more focused on Jesus than their present versions. But this is not a position on the historicity of the return from the exile, a Zerubbabel, a Jesus Jehozadak, an Ezra, or a Nehemiah. As far as I'm concerned, this is just literature. Jeremiah gets rejected by his own people. The people of Jeremiah's hometown reject him when he preached to them. This is what he discovered in chapter 11, verse 19. But I was like a gentle lamb led to the slaughter, and I did not know it was against me that they devised schemes, saying, let us destroy the tree with its fruit. Let us cut him off from the land of the living, so that his name will no longer be remembered. And then a little further down in 11:21, therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the people of Anathoth, that's Jeremiah's hometown, who seek your life and say, you shall not prophesy in the name of the Lord, or you will die by our hand. So there we have it. Jeremiah is being rejected by his hometown. So he's rejected by his hometown based on his preaching. Jeremiah fervently warns Jerusalem and is put in prison for it. Jehovah tells Jeremiah that he will send fishermen to search out the Israelites who have sinned against him. Within 40 years of beginning his preaching, being rejected by his hometown, and thrown in prison, Jerusalem will fall, and the temple. So the Jerusalem also fell 40 years after the evil generation of Numbers 14 rejected the message of Jesus, son of Nun. Jerusalem also falls about 40 years after Jesus of Nazareth preached, warned of impending doom to the temple, and was also rejected by his hometown. And he does talk about being rejected by that evil generation. Clearly, this story of a man warning Jerusalem of its impending doom would resonate with the author of Mark. The story of Jeremiah resonates with the author of Mark, who is writing as Jerusalem has once again been sacked and the temple destroyed, just as it had in Jeremiah's day. Jeremiah is Jehovah's tool, saying whatever Jehovah wants him to say. At one point, Jehovah tells Jeremiah to tell Jerusalem it is doomed. So in Jeremiah 18:5, we have, then the word of the Lord came to me. Can I not do with you, O house of Israel, just as this potter has done, says the Lord? Just like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. At one moment I may declare concerning a king, a kingdom or nation, that I will pluck up and break down and destroy it. But if that nation, concerning which I have spoken, turns from its evil, I will change my mind about the disaster that I intend to bring upon it. And at another moment, I may declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build and plant it. But if it does evil in my sight, not listening to my voice, Then I will change my mind about that good and that I had intended to do to it. Now, therefore, say to the people of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, Thus says the Lord, Look, I am a potter shaping evil against you and devising a plan against you. Turn now, all of you, from your evil way and amend your ways and your doings. Just as Jesus, son of Nun's message of going into Canaan was rejected, and the people sought to stone him, those listening to Jeremiah's message sought to punish the messenger. Jeremiah 18:18. Then they said, Come, let us make plots against Jeremiah, for instruction shall not perish from the priests, nor counsel from the wise, nor the word from the prophet. Come, let us bring charges against him, and let us not heed any of his words. I should make clear there that this Jeremiah 18:18 is the extension of what I just read, where Jeremiah is talking about Israel being like clay in the potter's hands. So he warns them, and this is their response to plot against him. Jeremiah is okay with foreign rule. He calls Nebuchadnezzar the servant of Jehovah. There's three examples of this. In Jeremiah 25:9, we have King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, my servant. In 27:6, again, this is Jehovah speaking, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, my servant. And Jeremiah 43:10, my servant King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And these are all from the NRSV, and the NRSV uses the various versions of the name of the king of Babylon that we see here, with that N being replaced by an R. I pasted a link so that you can look up the fact that this is all referring to the same king of Babylon. So Jeremiah tells the king of Judah to give in to Nebuchadnezzar in order to save his own life. This is an example of one who wants to save his life but loses it. Thus says the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, if you will only surrender to the officials of the king of Babylon, then your life will be spared, and this city shall not be burned with fire, and you and your house shall live. Jeremiah implores the king of Jerusalem to give in to the foreign ruler. Thus says the Lord, those who stay in this city shall die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence, but those who go out to the Chaldeans shall live. They shall have their lives as a prize of war and live. Thus says the Lord, this city shall surely be handed over to the army of the king of Babylon, and he will take it. Mark's Jesus of Nazareth will implore those listening to him to seek peace and not an insurrection. Well, to seek peace when he talks about the kingdom coming. And 12:17, Jesus said to them, give Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were utterly amazed at him. So in that particular scenario, he's talking about submission to the powers that Jehovah has put into place, whether that's Nebuchadnezzar, whether that is Claudius or Caligula or Cyrus, the king of Persia. Jeremiah predicts the people will return after 70 years in exile. 25:11, these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Next verse, after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon. A few chapters later, only when Babylon's 70 years are completed will I visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. Not only is Nebuchadnezzar a foreign ruler that Jehovah is using as a tool, but the return of the people after the exile will be dependent on another foreign ruler, also appointed or anointed by Jehovah. At some point in time, a phrase concluding that Cyrus fulfilled Jeremiah's promise shows up at the end of 2 Chronicles and the beginnings of Ezra. They are most identical. So I'm going to quote Ezra 1:1. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord from the mouth of Jeremiah, The Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also in writing, saying, Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. So Jeremiah seems to clearly be talking about Cyrus's proclamation when he is predicting the 70 years of exile coming to an end and Judah being restored. Jehovah is using both Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus. These great emperors are used by Jehovah and are not necessarily the enemy of the people who worship Jehovah. This is a feature of Jesus of Nazareth, who says to give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Somebody has to lead the Judahites back, or Judeans, back to a restored promised land. Jeremiah compares this task to what Moses and Jesus none did in the Exodus and conquest. Jeremiah repeats this comparison. He does it once in chapter 16 and once in chapter 23. And they're almost exactly identical, but you may find some differences. Those differences may have theological meanings, but we're not really interested in those here. It's pretty much cut and dry that he's looking for a repeat of what happened in the Exodus and conquest by a return of the exile. I'll read the first one. The second one's almost identical. Therefore, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when it shall no longer be said, as the Lord lives who brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But as the Lord lives who brought the people of Israel up out of the land of the north and out of all the lands where he had driven them. For I will bring them back to their own land that I gave to their ancestors. Jeremiah even names the leader who will return with the exiles. Again, he repeats this prophecy once in connection to the promise in the previous slide. There, one instance of the comparison with the Exodus conquest is chapter 23, verse 7. One verse earlier, we have 23:6. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will live in safety. And this is the name by which he will be called. Jehovah is our righteousness. 10 chapters later, 33:16. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is the name by which it will be called. Jehovah is our righteousness. So what kind of name is that? It sounds more like a phrase. In the translation of the Greek Septuagint by Lord Brenton, we have 23:6. In his days, both Judah shall be saved and Israel shall dwell securely. And this is his name, which the Lord shall call him, Josedek among the prophets. This is the man usually translated to Josedek in Ezra and Nehemiah, and Jehozadak in 1 Chronicles 6, Haggai, and Nehemiah. Jehozadak is usually translated as Jehovah is righteous. He is the father of Jesus, who leads the people back from exile in Ezra and Nehemiah. So what about the line of David if Jesus is leading the people back from the exile? Jeremiah 23:5. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I'll raise up for David a righteous branch, and he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. So that phrase is usually talking about a lineage of a kingship, and you would think that that successor would have to be of the line of David. And we'll continue on. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will live in safety, and this is the name by which he will be called. Jehovah is our righteousness. And the closest we have to that is this guy Jehozadak, who is the father of Jesus, who in 4 books is a key part of bringing the people back from the exile. Therefore, the days are surely coming, says the Lord, when it shall no longer be said, as the Lord lives who brought the people of Israel up out of the out of the land of Egypt. But as the Lord who brought out and led the offspring of the house of Israel out of the land of the north and out of all the lands where he had driven them, then they shall live in their own land. Jeremiah clearly connects this Jehovah is our righteousness, or Jehozadak, with a branch that will be raised for David. Why do I bring all this up? Because there is a person side by side in each book, except for Zechariah, that is side by side with Jesus, son of Jehozadak. And his name is Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. And Zerubbabel is either the grandson or the great-grandson of the last king, or one of the last kings of Jerusalem before the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar. So what we're trying to tie together here are the people who went into exile as Jerusalem was destroyed, and the people who led the exile, the return from the exile. So what preceded the first promise of a branch raised for David? Remember, there's two promises. One is in chapter 23, and one is in chapter 33, and they're almost identical. For our purposes, I believe they are. But we got to put each of these promises into context. So the first promise is in chapter 23, and immediately before that, in chapter 22, we have this. As I live, says the Lord, even if King Coniah, son of Jehoiakim of Judah, were the signet ring on my right hand, even from there I would tear you off and give you into the hands of those who seek your life, into the hands of those whom you fear, even into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and into the hands of the Chaldeans. I will hurl you and the mother who bore you into another country, where you were not born, and there you shall die. But they shall not return to the land to which they long to return. Is this man Coniah a despised broken pot, a vessel no one wants? Why are he and his offspring hurled out and cast away in a land that they do not know? O land, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, record this man as childless, a man who shall not succeed in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. So I highlighted that last part, none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah. But there's other sections that say basically the same thing. Why are he and his offspring hurled out and cast away? So it seems pretty clear there that that's the end of the Davidic line, according to Jeremiah chapter 22. And then the promise of the branch being raised up for David is the very next chapter, and this seems to be Jehozadak. Jehozadak and his son Jesus seem to fill the prophecy of Jeremiah 23, despite not being of Davidic line or even of the tribe of Judah. Jehozadak's lineage is listed under the Levites in the book of 1 Chronicles chapter 6. However, there is a near copy of the promises of a branch of chapter 23, and this copy is found in chapter 33. There, Jehovah gives a strong commitment to the house of David. Reading again, 33:15 and 16. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is the name by which it shall be called. The Lord is our righteousness. So that seems to be talking about Jehozadak. But in the next verse, for thus says the Lord, David shall never lack a man to sit on the throne of the house of Israel. And the Levitical priest shall never lack a man in my presence to offer burnt offerings, to make grain offerings, and to make sacrifices for all time. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. Thus says the Lord, if any of you could break my covenant with the day and my covenant with the night, so that day and night would not come at their appointed time, only then could my covenant with my servant David be broken, so that he would not have a son to reign on his throne, and my covenant with my ministers, the Levites. Just as the hosts of heaven cannot be numbered and the sands of the sea cannot be measured, so I will increase the offspring of my servant David and the Levites who minister to me. The promise of the commitment to the houses of David and Levi continues in what seems to be either the most solid footing possible or hyperbole. Thus says the Lord, this is later in the chapter 33, only if I had not established my covenant with day and night and the ordinance of heaven and earth, would I reject the offspring of Jacob and my servant David, and not choose any of his descendants as rulers over the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. For I will restore their fortunes and will have mercy upon them. There is an emphasis on the theme of day and night coming at their appointed times. That seems like a pretty secure promise in chapter 33 that the Davidic line will continue, whereas in chapter 22 we saw that the Davidic line was going to come to an end. So Jeremiah puts out these prophecies, and as I've said before, other books answer Jeremiah pretty much directly. Haggai attempts to answer Jeremiah. Haggai mentions both Zerubbabel of the Davidic line and Jesus of the Levitical line in that order. Zerubbabel is listed as a descendant of Coniah, who is also known as Jeconiah and Jehoiachin in 1 Chronicles. Haggai closes with this rebuttal to Jeremiah's scathing prophecy about the lineage of Coniah. In Haggai chapter 2, verse 23, on that day, says Jehovah of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, son of Shealtiel, says Jehovah, and make you like a signet ring. For I have chosen you, says the Lord of hosts. Remember, we just read in Jeremiah 22, as I live, says Jehovah, even if Coniah, son of Jehoiakim of Judah, were the signet ring on my right hand, even from there I would tear you off. So he has repudiated the Davidic line in chapter 22, and the whole chapter 22 of Jeremiah is a repudiation of the kings and how they've treated the people. And the end of chapter 22 really focuses on this king Coniah and his offspring. So this is important because it's supposedly Coniah's offspring, Zerubbabel, who is this important factor in leading people back from the exile. And that's the argument. Haggai comes down on the side that Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, son or grandson of Coniah, is the leader of Judea. Another prophet has another opinion. Zechariah seems to find a different answer. He has Jesus, son of Jehozadak, crowned, probably as both governor and high priest. Zerubbabel is mentioned in one chapter, but I will contend that there are good reasons to think this is an interpolation. In other words, it was added later. Not only the book of Zechariah, but also the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, despite their attempts to impugn the tradition of Jesus, son of Jehozadak, will ultimately show just how important the tradition of Jesus Jehozadak was to their community. When Haggai directly answers Jeremiah 22's claim with a statement about a signet ring, it is hard to imagine Zechariah's answer to Jeremiah 33's claim about the Davidic line being as secure as day and night coming at their appointed times. Perhaps this secure promise about day and night goes unanswered. However, In Zechariah 14:7, we have, "And there shall be continuous day, it is known to the Lord, not day and night, for at evening time there shall be light." I'm not sure if that verse qualifies as a repudiation of the promise in Jeremiah 33. So, about Jeremiah 33, another aspect of this, remember, Jeremiah 22 promises the end of the Davidic line, and then the next chapter promises a branch raised up to David, and it seems to be Jehozadak, who's a Levite. In Jeremiah 33, we have the same promise of a branch brought to the line of David, but his name seems to be Jehozadak, who is, for all intents and purposes, for all the genealogies we have, a Levite. So, what do the New Testament authors read when they read the Septuagint? So, Jeremiah 33, 14 through 26, this is the promises that secure the Davidic line as long as there's night and day in their proper place. This is not found in the Greek version of the Bible called the Septuagint. The Septuagint's version of Jeremiah is probably the most rearranged book compared to the Masoretic tradition out of all the books of the Old Testament. This prophecy against the nations, the prophecies against the nations, chapters 46 through 51, come much earlier in the Septuagint. They come in chapters 25 through 30. And so the displaced material goes later in the Septuagint. So what would be chapter 25 gets moved all the way to chapter 31 or 32. And so there's a 7-chapter difference. There are other differences. I'm not trying to explain all the differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic versions of Jeremiah. But one is that everything gets rearranged. And so when we're looking for the second promise in Jeremiah 33, it's not there. 33, 14 through 26 of the Masoretic text has this promise. And when we go looking in the Septuagint, we look in chapter 40, which is word for word with chapter 33 until it just cuts off after verse 13. And verse 14 all the way through 26 is the promise of the branch and the promise of the Davidic lineage. All that's missing from chapter 40 in the Septuagint, which is much shorter than chapter 33 of the Masoretic. There should be a 40, 14 through 26 in the Septuagint that contains everything from 33, 14, 26 in the Masoretic, but it simply does not exist. So anyone reading the Septuagint version of Jeremiah, like the New Testament authors, would not have read the scathing rebuke of would not have read the promise of restoring the Davidic and Levite lines tied to the covenant with day and night in Jeremiah 33. So this slide is actually correct, and I read it wrong, and I'll try it again. So anyone reading the Septuagint version of Jeremiah, like the New Testament authors, would have read the scathing rebuke of Coniah and his descendants of Jeremiah 22, thus ending the Davidic line, and would not have read the promise of restoring the Davidic and Levite lines tied to the covenant with day and night in Jeremiah 33, because it's not in the Septuagint text. It is interesting to note this. It is probably important to the argument of Zerubbabel versus Jesus Jehozadak as a messianic figure. However, it is enough at this time to note that Haggai supported Zerubbabel as the leader primarily, and Zechariah supported a different Judean Messiah leading the people back from Babylon. In particular, Zechariah crowns Jesus Jehoshaphat. Jeremiah can be seen as a bridge between two Jesuses. Jesus Nun, who first brought Israel into the Promised Land, and Jesus Jehoshaphat, who led those returning from exile. This interpretation is especially found in Zechariah. So Zechariah, as an answer to Jeremiah, promotes Jesus Jehoshaphat. Haggai promotes Zerubbabel as an alternative, and Ezra and Nehemiah seem to promote Cyrus as the Messiah and themselves as answers to the problems at hand. In other words, Ezra and Nehemiah are the leaders who are sent to establish how Jerusalem should be ruled. Jeremiah is also a bit of a pattern for Jesus of Nazareth, while at the same time reflecting Jesus, son of Nun. All three were rejected by their people to the point of threatening death. All three saw Jerusalem destroyed in 40 years of their initial warning not to reject God. Mark is writing after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which is precisely what Jeremiah witnessed over 600 years prior. If you are curious about the backstory of Christianity, then I think my material will prove valuable. If you have any questions, please write them down below or send them to me at vpwvpw123@gmail.com. Questions do help me refine my hypothesis. I have scheduled myself to post every other Sunday by 3 p.m. to investigate further on this subject matter, and this subject matter only, the literary sources of first century Jesus tales.